Good evening. Welcome back to the book of Daniel. We're in Daniel chapter 2, verses 1 to 30. This is lesson 2. Again, I am putting this content up for my Sunday school class members. In the event they miss a class, they're able to at least catch the content that we had that Sunday. I've entitled the lesson, and you'll see why, Calm in the Midst of Chaos. And that's exactly what we find. Everyone in this story is in an absolute swirl. Chaos is really pulling in everyone because of Nebuchadnezzar's really overreaction and just how he freaks out about this dream that he can't seem to remember. And everyone is in chaos with the exception of Daniel and by extension his three friends Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And so again, we're back to the book of Daniel, lesson 2, verses 1 through 30 of chapter 2. So we find ourselves back in the city of Babylon, back again with Daniel and his three friends. Again, they were taken captive by Nebuchadnezzar's army in 605 BC, so it's right around 604 BC now. Just by way of reminder, that was only in 605 BC the first wave of the deportation. The second wave occurred in 597 BC. That's when Ezekiel was taken captive. And then the third and final wave was 586 BC. And that's when the temple was destroyed. As we talked about in the first lesson, this was all God's judgment upon the nation of Israel, and in particular the city of Jerusalem. This was God raising up a pagan king, giving him great power, and using that king and his kingdom as an instrument of judgment against his people who were disobedient to him. We saw what Nebuchadnezzar did. He was bringing in the choice teenagers, putting them really in a 3-year training program with the goal of indoctrinating them, assimilating them. We talked about all of that last week. And as I said, we are entering this where the Babylonian Empire is at their peak. For those who weren't in Sunday school class, I'm glad the slide came up. Just by way of reminder, we are having another get-together at my house on March the 4th. So we voted, so skip the part about February 25th. We voted Sunday. So we will be getting together March the 4th at my house. So if you're seeing this for the first time, please let me know. Again, we'll be determining what we're going to smoke or what we're going to eat. So more to follow. Sorry to jump right out of the lesson to that, but the slide came up. So just by way of reminder, we are looking at the Babylonian Empire at its zenith. This is really at its peak. They have taken over all of the old Assyrian Empire. They've taken over Judah and Benjamin, the southern tribes. They've taken over Egypt. This is really the strongest they will get under Nebuchadnezzar. Just by way of reminder, as we talk about the deportation, as a crow flies, about 500 miles from Jerusalem to Babylon, averaging 3 miles a day, 15 hours a day. That's 45 miles a day. It would have taken them 11 days to make this trip. Scholars tell us that probably the trade routes would have doubled the trip, so it was more like probably 1,000 miles. So then you're talking about a 22, 23-day trip. So it would have been very brutal as those waves of deportation occurred. Continuing on, just by way of reminder, we're talking about Daniel. Again, we estimate he was around 17 when he went into captivity. So he was born roughly 622 BC. Lived around 90 years, so that gives you an idea of the length of life. He is contemporary with Ezekiel. Again, Ezekiel went into captivity in the second deportation, and he's also contemporary with Jeremiah, the weeping prophet. This is just a reminder of sort of an artist's rendition of the outlay of the city of Babylon. Again, about 200 square miles, about the size of the city of Chicago. You can 8 gates in all. You can see a moat. So this is the Euphrates River going through the middle of the city, and they actually siphoned off the Euphrates and put a moat that went all the way around the city. You can see pagan temples all over the city. This is the northern fortress. This is the southern fortress. This is the the processional way leading to the Edamananke, which is the platform between heaven and earth. And again, the platform at Edamananke had Nebuchadnezzar built a temple to Marduk on the top of that. And again, by way of reminder, Marduk was the patron god of the city, while Nabu was the god that Nebuchadnezzar worshipped. Artist rendition of the city. Again, what you should catch, this is Edamananke here. Absolutely beautiful, extremely fortified, Gold and blue everywhere. You're probably wondering, how do we know that? Well, I'll show you in a second. Another artist's rendition of the city. You can see the Euphrates going through the middle. Again, they've siphoned off. This city was really viewed as impenetrable. We'll talk about how Cyrus penetrated it when we get to that. But again, with God, nothing's impenetrable. There's the Edamananke, the platform between heaven and earth. Again, according to the History Channel, the Edamananke was about 280 foot tall, so roughly the equivalent of a 26-story building by today's standards. This is the Ishitar Gate, again, in the Pergamon Museum. They actually dug it up out of the sand there about 50 miles outside of Baghdad. And you can visit this now in the museum. These are people right here, so that gives you just an idea of the size of the gate. That was a mural that was in the palace. This is an artist's rendition of the Ishitar Gate. There's the Edamananke in the background. You can see the walls. You can see, as you look at the processional way, 200 meters long, and you can see they have this little mural going down the side of that. That's actually exactly how it looked. There's that mural in the Pergamon Museum, again, 200 meters long. You'll see the lines with the wings. This will come up again later, so don't forget about that. And again, another artist's rendition of the Edamananke. Now, according to the History Channel, Nebuchadnezzar really fortified this city, and it had 3 rings of walls that were all 40 feet tall, if you can imagine that. So if you made it through the first wall, you had another one, and if you made it through the second one, you had another one. According to Herodotus, the Greek historian, the walls were so thick that they held chariot races on the top of them, if you can imagine that. But as you think about this place, really what you should think about is a place that was very beautiful, very powerful, very wealthy, loaded with idols, idolatry. This was a totally different place than these 4 Jewish boys who have become men was accustomed to. This was much different than anything they had ever experienced in their life. And so as I come to our lesson this morning, I really wanted to set a few verses before you to sort of frame up some of the things I want to say today. So Psalm 37, 7 through 9, the psalmist said, "Be still before the Lord and wait patiently for him. Fret not yourself over the one who prospers in his way, over the man who carries out evil devices. Refrain from anger and forsake wrath. Fret not yourself, it tends only to evil. For the evildoers shall be cut off, but those who wait for the Lord shall inherit the land." And again, so I want to set before you this idea of waiting on the Lord, this idea of trusting in the Lord, this idea of even when things seem chaotic, not being swept into the chaos. The writer of Ecclesiastes, Solomon, said this in Ecclesiastes 10, "If the anger of the ruler rises against you, do not leave your place, for calmness will lay great offenses to rest." We will see in Daniel today a man who is calm. Not because he's stoic or disconnected, but because he's a man who's relying on God. He's trusting in God. He's walking with God. And so he exhibits a godly calmness. And then finally, we'll quote our Lord himself, John 14:27, "Peace I leave with you, my peace I give to you. Not as the world gives do I give it to you. Let not your heart be troubled, neither let them be afraid." And so again, if I could frame up our lesson, if there's anything for us to take away from this lesson at the human level, at the day-to-day faith level, walking by faith level, it's this idea of walking with God, trusting in God, enjoying the peace of God that passes all understandings. To go to Philippians chapter 4, to be anxious for nothing, but in everything with prayer and supplication, with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. And the peace of God, which passes all understanding, will guard your hearts and minds in Christ Jesus. And so I say all that to set up the lesson. We'll have much more to say about other things, but again, that's our takeaway as believers, to sort of steal a little of Daniel's calmness in our day-to-day walk with our Savior. Okay, so let's get at it. Daniel chapter 2, beginning in verse 1. "In the 2nd year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams. His spirit was troubled, and his sleep left him. Then the king commanded that the magicians, the enchanters, the sorcerers, and the Chaldeans be summoned to tell the king his dreams. So they came in and stood before the king. And the king said to them, I had a dream, and my spirit is troubled to know the dream. Now I want to pause right there. I already told you this last week, but beginning in verse 4, the book shifts to Aramaic. So it was Hebrew up until now. It's going to shift to Aramaic, and it's going to remain Aramaic until we go into chapter 8. So beginning in verse 4, shifting to Aramaic. Then the Chaldeans said to the king in Aramaic, O king, live forever. Tell your servants the dream, and we will show the interpretation. The king answered and said to the Chaldeans, The word for me is firm. If you do not make known to me the dream and its interpretation, you shall be torn limb from limb, and your houses shall be laid in ruins. But if you show the dream and its interpretation, you shall receive from me gifts and rewards and great honor. Therefore show me the dream and its interpretation. Verse 7. They answered a second time and said, Let the king tell his servants the dream, and we will show you its interpretation. The king answered and said, I know with certainty that you are trying to gain time, because you see that the word from me is firm. If you do not make the dream known to me, there's but one sentence for you. You have agreed to speak lying and corrupt words before me till the times change. Therefore, tell me the dream, and I shall know that you can show me the interpretations. Verse 10. The Chaldeans answered the king, this is again, and said, There's not a man on earth who can meet the king's demands, for no great and powerful king has asked such a thing of any magician or enchanter or Chaldean. The thing that the king asks is difficult, and no one can show it to the king except the gods, whose dwelling is not with flesh. So again, now we're just going to pick right back up. We're going to walk through these verses, and I would ask you to place yourself in the shoes of whoever we're talking about. So right now it's these wise men that have been ushered in. Ultimately, though, the rest of it's going to be Daniel. And so put yourself in their shoes, experience these verses like they would experience them. Experience all of it like it would play out just as if you were standing there. So as we pick up in verse 1, we can see it's the second year of Nebuchadnezzar. He's having dreams. His spirit is troubled, and he cannot sleep. So again, we see this is anchored in history. We know the year's about 604 BC. And the strongest, most powerful man on the planet is troubled and cannot sleep. As I told the Sunday school class, there is some irony here. The man who troubled so many nations is now troubled by God. The man who disturbed so many nations is now disturbed by a dream. Ultimately, the king commands that the magicians, the enchanters, the sorcerers, and the Chaldeans be summoned to tell him his dreams. 4 different words there. Kartom is the word translated magician. It's used 11 times as magician. It can mean a divinator, a magician, but it can also mean a scholar. So this could be occultic as well as academic. And it could probably even be both. The second word, ashaf, astrologer. This is someone who charts the stars. Probably involved both astrology and astronomy. The third word, kashaf. This seems to be a sorcerer, like a witch. And then the last one, Kazdi, is Chaldeans. These are people from lower Mesopotamia. And apparently over time, this word began to be used for people who were extremely wise. They were the Chaldeans. And so I say all that to say what we need to picture is this is the dream team of the day. No pun intended, of course. But this is like the scholars of the day, the religious leaders of the day, the astrologers of the day, the proto-scientists of the day. This is the brain trust of the day. This is everyone who's anyone who could possibly interpret dreams. They've been ushered in to the king, these magicians, enchanters, sorcerers, and Chaldeans, to tell the king his dreams. Now, although Daniel is among this group, he's not in this group, and that may be just because he's still in the training program, or because he just got out of the training program. He's still maybe an apprentice. But at any rate, he's not with this group right now, but he is among the wise men. We'll see that in verse 12 as he's swept into this. Verse 3. And the king said to them, that's this dream team, or this, this team of like the brain trust, if you will. And he says to them, I had a dream. My spirit is troubled to know the dream. So Although scholars disagree, it seems, as you look at this story play out, and again, some translations handle it differently, but it seems like he's had nightmares, but one of them in particular really disturbed him. He can't quite remember the dream. It's just like at the edge of his remembrance. And he's brought this dream team in, this brain trust, and they're to tell him the dream. Now, as this unfolds, I want you to see a few traits of Nebuchadnezzar. We'll start with 3. And these are common to men and women who do not know God when they feel threatened. The first one, and we saw this as we read it, is insecurity. This is the most powerful man on the planet, and yet he is becoming completely unraveled by a dream. The second one is hostility. A better word might be rage. An unreasonable lashing out in complete anger at his dream team, at his brain trust, because they can't do what no one can do. They cannot do what anyone can do. And then the other one is fear. And this is rather shocking. Again, the most powerful man in the known world at the time, and clearly, as he cannot sleep, clearly he is engulfed in fear. Now, obviously, I believe that God is the one who gave him the dream, and we'll explain why as we go. I believe God is the one who's kind of washed the dream out of his mind, so he can't quite remember it, and we'll talk about that as we go. And I would remind you, as you think about how he's reacting with insecurity, hostility, and fear. The writer of Proverbs said in Proverbs 28 that the wicked flee when no one pursues, but the righteous are as bold as a lion. And here is Nebuchadnezzar, the most powerful man on the planet at the time, and he is overcome by fear. Now again, we can't be sure, but it seems like Nebuchadnezzar does not trust his brain trust, but he definitely wants them to tell him the dream. Verse 4, the Chaldeans speak, and they said, "O king, live forever." And that's standard court talk, right? You say that every time, I guess, you're in the presence of a king. But they said, "Tell your servants the dream, and we will show you the interpretation." That seems like a reasonable request, right? With this king, we do this all the time. You tell us the dream, we give you the interpretation. The king's having nothing to do with this. In verses 5 and 6, he says, no, the word is firm. In other words, this is a set thing for me. And then he goes on to say, and this is where we look at his insecurity and his fear and all this other stuff, if you do not make the dream known to me and its interpretation, I'm going to have you torn limb from limb, and your houses, the ESV says, laid into ruins. The Aramaic word means dunghill or outhouse. I'm going to have your homes turned into an outhouse. But if you show me the dream and its interpretation, I'll give you gifts and reward and great honor. Therefore, tell me the dream and the interpretation. So pretty straightforward. He's having nothing to do with this. And I would now add another word. So we saw insecurity, hostility, fear, and that's irrational. Clearly, this behavior is extremely irrational. He has become completely freaked out. We've gone from, I don't know how many, wise men, but he's now threatening for all the wise men in Babylon to have them put to death by tearing them apart and to have their houses leveled and turned into dung heaps. He is in a full-blown panic mode, and nothing is actually pursuing him. There's nothing that should be bringing him panic. Now, the Chaldeans in verse 7, they answer a second time, and they said, "Hey, let the king tell the servants a dream, and we will show the interpretation," right? Seems pretty reasonable. And so the king answers the third time, "I know with certainty you're trying to gain time. You see, it's firm for me. If you don't make known to me the dream, there's only one sentence for you. You've agreed to speak lying and corrupt words before me till the time changes. Therefore, tell me the dream and its interpretation." So you see, as you walk through verse 8 and 9, he said he's just leveling accusations at them. His dream team, his brain trust, he's now accusing them of you are forming a cabal. You are just doing nothing other than conspiring and colluding together to just give corrupt words and lying speech to me. You're hoping to buy time until the news cycle shifts. There's only one thing. The word is firm for me. In verses 10 and 11, the Chaldeans answer the king the third time, "There's not a man on earth who can meet the king's demands. For no great and powerful king has asked such a thing. of any magician or enchanter or Chaldean. The thing that the king asks is difficult, and no one can show it to the king except the gods whose dwelling is not with flesh. Now that is awesome. That'll come back around. But what God is doing here is setting the stage. He's already proven that Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's value, their understanding of Chaldean law and ways is 10 times better than any of his other wise men. But now he's about to elevate Daniel as the only man who can speak for the true and living God, the only man who has a connection with God, the only man who can explain things that no human being except the gods can explain. You see that in verse 11. This thing is difficult, king, and no one can show it to you except the gods. And guess what? Daniel's going to be the man who is going to speak for the true and living God. Now, you know, one of the things we talked about in the class was, why would God give this amazing vision to a pagan king? Good question, and I pondered it. I think there's 4 possibilities, and all 4 are quite possibly correct. The first one is Psalm 135:6. Whatsoever the Lord pleases, he does in the heaven and the earth and the seas and deep places. God does what he wants and doesn't answer to us about who he gives dreams to. He gave dreams to Pharaoh. He gave a dream to Abimelech. God has no problem giving dreams to pagans, and he doesn't answer to us. So that's the first thing. Number 2, I would remind us that the nation of Israel was completely apostate. They were as bad as Nebuchadnezzar, in fact worse, because they had the word of God. So speaking to giving this vision to a pagan king, not that big of a stretch. The whole nation practically was pagan. But equally, there was something else here. By giving it to the king, he was setting up a scenario where Daniel was going to be the eminent Chaldean, the eminent wise man, the eminent speaker of unspeakable things, the one who was connected to God. And then finally, I would just remind us that throughout the Bible, God is always working, even with lost kings and lost pharaohs, to make himself known. That's the mercy of our God. And so it is some of those, it is indeed all of those. But you can see as we look at these first 11 verses, King Nebuchadnezzar is absolutely outraged. Heads are going to roll if they don't tell him the dream and the interpretation. It's brought great fear and panic upon him. He wants to know what it is. Picking up in verse 12. Because of this, the king was angry and very furious, and commanded that all the wise men of Babylon be destroyed. So the decree went out, and the wise men were about to be killed, and they sought Daniel and his companions to kill them. Then Daniel replied with prudence and discretion to Arioch, the captain of the king's guard, who had gone out to kill the wise men of Babylon. He declared to Arioch, the king's captain, "Why is the decree of the king so urgent?" Then Arioch made the matter known to Daniel, and Daniel went in and requested the king to appoint him a time that he might show the interpretation to the king. So because of all this back and forth, right, you could picture it, the king becomes angry. That's not enough. The king becomes angry and very furious. He is filled with insecurity. He is filled with fear. He is filled with irrationality, and he is filled with absolute anger and hostility. He is angry and very furious. So he gives a command to destroy all the wise men of Babylon. Now again, we're assuming that's the city and not the nation, but nonetheless, this could have been hundreds of people. He is so enraged and so irrational, he's going to wipe out all of his wise men because they cannot do what any man can do. They can't. There's no one alive who can do this. In fact, the command has gone out, and as you can see, they're looking for Daniel and his friends, his companions, to kill them. That's how this has really gone out. And in verse 14, we looked at words from Nebuchadnezzar. We're introduced to 2 words about Daniel. Then Daniel replied with prudence and discretion, or prudence and wisdom, or prudence and judgment. So we saw those 4 words of Daniel, or of Nebuchadnezzar, but here's 4 words of Daniel. here's a man in the midst of chaos who goes to Arioch, who's the captain of the king's guard, likely the leader of the group who's bringing together the wise men to kill them. And he enters into a discussion with Arioch. That's amazing that Arioch just doesn't kill him right on the spot. And he asks this question, and he does so with prudence and discretion and judgment and wisdom. And Arioch even explains it to him in verse 15. We cannot imagine what this looks like, but Daniel asks it a question, and then Arioch makes known to him. And then somehow, Daniel interacts with Arioch and gets to leave. He gets to go off. Arioch is in the process of gathering up people to be killed, gathering up these wise men, but somehow in verse 16, Daniel is allowed to go and interact with whoever sets the king's appointments and make an appointment with the king to make the matter known. This is shocking at how this played out. Now, a few things. As we think about this, time is the one thing that no one has. The wise men wanted more time. They had no more time, yet somehow Daniel goes into the king and gets more time. The king appoints him a time. He gets more time. Whether he says, okay, come back later or come back at this set time, we cannot be sure. But it is shocking that the one thing no one received, Daniel asks of the king and gets it. Now, you might say, well, that's because he's 10 times better, and the king remembers that, and so he gives him time. Sure, maybe. Let me tell you the ultimate reason. Writer of Proverbs says it in Proverbs 21:1. The king's heart is in the hand of the Lord. As rivers of water, streams of water, he turns it whithersoever he will. I don't care who the king is in your life. His heart is in the hand of the Lord. And although chaos was ensuing and Arioch was sweeping up the wise men and they're getting ready to put them all to death, somehow Daniel is allowed to leave Arioch and go talk to the king and set up an appointment. And somehow, after the king has told everyone no one gets more time, he gives Daniel more time because the king's heart is in the hand of the Lord. But there's another point I want you to see here. Daniel fully trusted in his God. He didn't know how this was going to play out, but he was trusting that God was going to take care of him and his three friends. He didn't know how it was going to play out. You'll see that in a moment. But Daniel had to know. Now that he had extended the time with the king, if he went back to the king and said, I really don't know, and by the way, right now he does not know, that was not going to go good with him. But I want you to see something else in Daniel, and that's the humility, the wisdom, the prudence, the discretion, and yet the boldness. He's responding in great, just godly humility, but yet great godly boldness, that he's interacting with Arioch, that he's going in and interacting the king. And I do find it I do find it funny as I think back, verse 8, where the king said, I know for certain that you are trying to gain time. And then Daniel comes in and God gives him more time. And as I was thinking on this, I was just thinking, and I could picture our brother Daniel standing before that Muriel in Nebuchadnezzar's courtroom. Little Daniel, 18-year-old man, boy, teenager, young man, cool, calm, collected, as he interacts with the most powerful man on the planet. It's an incredible story. Verse 17. So Daniel goes into the king. He gets an extension. He has no idea what the dream is or the interpretation. Verse 17. Then Daniel went to his house and made the matter known to Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, his companions. You can imagine what that sounded like as he walked there and said, hey, I got a little problem I want to talk to you guys about. And he told them to seek mercy from the God of heaven concerning this mystery, so that Daniel and his companions might not be destroyed with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. Then the mystery was revealed to Daniel in a vision of the night. Then Daniel blessed the God of heaven. Daniel answered and said, Blessed be the name of God forever and ever, to whom belong wisdom and might. He changes times and seasons. He removes kings and sets up kings. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those who have understanding. He reveals deep and hidden things. He knows what is in the darkness, and the light dwells with him. To you, O God of my fathers, I give thanks and praise, for you have given me wisdom and might, and have now made known to me what we asked of you, for you have made known to us the king's matter. So verse 17, Daniel goes and he has this interaction with Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Again, I can only imagine how that went, but these are young men who are walking with God. Well, in fact, one of the men in our Sunday school class, is like, when did anyone ever get advice from a 17 or an 18-year-old? When there were godly young men like this. That's the answer to the question. So he goes home and he tells them to seek mercy from God of heaven concerning this mystery, so that we might not be destroyed and the rest of the wise men in Babylon. So I've given you a couple of words for Daniel. I want to give you another one, and that was prayer. Daniel was clearly a man of prayer. And we talked about this in Sunday school class, and I'll say it just in passing. If we are going to be used by God, we need to be prudent. We need to have discretion or wisdom. We must be people of prayer. We must be seeking help from the only one who can give us help, and that's our Lord. So Daniel was a man of prayer. Verse 19, and then so we read something amazing. The secret was revealed to Daniel. We're not surprised about that, in a night vision. So the implication here is that Daniel and his three friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, had a season of prayer, and then they did the unthinkable. They went to bed. They went to sleep. Here's a man relying on God. Here's a man trusting God. He has put the matter before God. No doubt they seriously prayed. His life is hanging in the balance, and he now goes to sleep, and God reveals it to him in a night vision. Verse 19, he wakes up. He now knows the answer. What is he going to do next? And that brings us to another word. Having learned the answer, Daniel immediately, I would have probably woke up my three friends and said, I know God told me, and then ran to the king. What Daniel did was first run to the king, the real king, the God of heaven. And he began to bless the God of heaven. And here's another word. So prudent, discerning, a man of prayer, and he was a man of worship. He didn't jump right up and run to the earthly king, even though his life was hanging in the balance, even though Arioch could have showed up at his door any time and said, time's up. But rather, he took time to thank God for answering his prayer. And that's another good lesson for us. We pray so much. Let's make sure that when God's delivering, and even when he's not delivering, we're thanking him for hearing our prayers, because we know he's answering our prayers according to his will. And so Daniel said, blessed is the name of God forever and ever. To him belongs wisdom and might. He changes seasons. He removes kings. He sets up kings. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those who have understanding. He reveals the deep and hidden things. He knows what is in the darkness, and the light dwells with him. Blessed be the name of God forever. And you can see that list of things that God does. He's the one who knows all these deep and hidden things. And then verse 23, he says this in the conclusion of his prayer of thanksgiving. To you, O God of my fathers, I give thanks and praise, for you have given me wisdom and might. You have made known to me what we ask of you. You have made known to us the king's matter. And we see him just worshiping God. I was reminded as I reflected on this whole event, James 1, as James is writing about trials and temptations. He says, my brethren, count it all joy when you fall into diverse temptations, diverse trials, knowing that the trying of your faith works patience. But let patience have her perfect work. Daniel had been thrust into the midst of a trial, and he was just walking with God through the details of it. He was really just connected with God through the trial so much it doesn't even look like a trial when you read about it, but yet it was a serious trial. And so here we are. Daniel is worshiping God, and we now come to the end of our verses for this time together, verse 24. Therefore Daniel went into Arioch, whom the king had appointed to destroy the wise men of Babylon. He went and said thus to him, do not destroy the wise men of Babylon. Bring me in before the king, and I will show the king the interpretation. Then Arioch brought in Daniel before the king in haste, and said thus to him, I have found among the exiles from Judah a man who will make known to the king the interpretation. The king declared to Daniel, whose name was Belteshazzar, Are you able to make known to me the dream that I have seen and its interpretation? Daniel answered the king and said, No wise man, enchanter, magician, or astrologer can show to the king the mystery that the king has asked. But there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries, and he has made known to King Nebuchadnezzar what will be in the latter days. Your dream and the visions of your head as you lay in your bed are these. To you, O king, as you lay in your bed, came thoughts of what would be after this. And he who reveals mysteries made known to you what is to be. But as for me, this mystery has been revealed to me, not because of any wisdom that I have more than all the living, but in order that the interpretation might be known to the king, and that you might know the thoughts of your mind. Wow! After a season of prayer, after a short nap, after a praise and worship session, Daniel goes to the chief executioner, and he says, Do not destroy the wise men. Bring me in before the king. I will show him the interpretation, and we understand by way of understanding the dream as well. Now, it is interesting here, Arioch, he operates in haste. So Arioch is still understanding that everyone's life is sort of hanging in the balance. And so he operates in haste and quickly goes into the king, quickly escorts Daniel in. And look what Arioch says to the king. I found among the exiles from Judah a man who will make known to the king the interpretation. Now, I don't want to be guilty of reading in more than here, but let's be honest. Technically, Daniel is the one who went and found Arioch. But you get how these things work. Everybody's trying to make sure they're important in the eyes of the king. Verse 26, you can see this doubting, skeptical king. He asks again, Are you able to make known to me the dream I have seen and its interpretation? So the king is double checking, hey, before we go any further, let's make sure we're talking dream and interpretation. Daniel's very next word is no. You wonder how he made it past that word while Arioch just didn't pull out a sticky. But what he said is no wise man, enchanter, magician, or astrologer can show the king the mystery that the king has asked. But there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries, and he has made known to King Nebuchadnezzar what will be in the latter days. Your dream and the visions of your head as you lay in your bed are these. So the Nebuchadnezzar had been dreaming about the future. He had been pondering about the future. He'd been thinking about the future. And now Daniel's telling him, I'm going to tell you the dream, but the truth is, it's just like the Chaldeans told you. It's just like your dream team, your brain trust told you. Nobody can tell you these things. No human being, nobody living can tell you these things, King, but there is a God in heaven, and he has made them known. He is the one who reveals mysteries, and he has made known to King Nebuchadnezzar what will be in the latter days. So we'll talk more about that next week as we get into the vision, the dream itself. But you see what Daniel does is he makes it clear that this isn't about Daniel's intellect. This is about the God of heaven revealing mysteries. This isn't about something Daniel did because no human being can do this. This is about what the God of heaven did, as he is the one who's going to reveal this. In verse 29, he explains to the king, when it happened, you were laying in your beds, you had thoughts, this came to you, and then Daniel is clear. This mystery was not revealed to me because of any wisdom that I have more than anyone else living. But it's all about, in order, King, that you might know the thoughts of your mind. You might know the dream, you might know the interpretation, and by way of extension, you might know that there's a God in heaven who answers, who is the true and living God and who reveals secrets. Now we'll pause here. Again, we'll pick back up as we look at the actual dream, Lord willing, next week. But now let's just do a couple points of application. Number one, we talked about lost people often when threatened will display insecurity, anger, hostility, fear, irrational behavior. And we get that, and we should not be surprised by it. What we should be surprised by is when we see these things in ourselves. These are not things of the Spirit of God. Anger is not something the Spirit of God gives us. Fear is not something. God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind. And so we need to be on the lookout. These are things of the old man, things that we should be putting to death. So by contrast, though, Daniel had every reason to be fearful. Nebuchadnezzar had none and was extremely fearful. Daniel had many reasons. His life was hanging in the balance, and yet we see prudence, discernment, wisdom. He was a man of prayer. He was a man of worship. He was humble, yet in his humility bold, because he was acting in faith. He was acting in trust. Another observation, I would remind all of us that God is the one who brought us all this together. He's the one who caused the dream. He's the one who probably removed most of the dream from Nebuchadnezzar's mind. He did all of this to panic Nebuchadnezzar and to place Daniel in Nebuchadnezzar's path. Daniel was God's man for the minute. God works in our world, and he works in us individually. And he's working in others individually, and he's placing us into those scenarios and situations. And so we often talk about in this lesson pictures of how Daniel is a portrait of Christ. But here Daniel is a nice portrait of how you and I should be. We should be modern day Daniels living in Babylon, yet citizens of the kingdom of heaven, ready for God to use us to interact with people that he's stirring. One of the things we talked about in class is God speaking through dreams. So first off, it's very common in the Bible. I already mentioned Pharaoh. I mentioned Abimelech. As you think about Joseph and Mary in Matthew 1, Joseph had a dream not to be afraid to take Mary as his wife. In Matthew 2, Joseph had a dream to flee to Egypt. Dreams are very common for God as a way to God to reveal things in the Old Testament. It was normative in the Bible days. Does it still happen now? So I don't know for sure, and as I told the class, opinion. This is Rich's opinion. I don't think God is revealing new things via dreams. I think once the canon closed, Revelations 22:18, what was true in the past is no longer true in the future. As the writer of Hebrews said it, God, who at sundry times and in various manners spoke in time past unto the fathers by the prophets. So God was speaking in these various ways, but it's in these last days that he speaks to us through his Son. But now I am smart enough to know that God can do whatever he wants. And if God wanted to speak through dreams to people, particularly in dark areas, because you hear some Muslims who have stories of how God came to them in a dream. I'm not going to rain on anybody's parade and say, no, that can't be of God. I'll reflect back to Psalm 135:6. Whatsoever the Lord pleases, he does in the heavens and earth and the seas and the great deep. He doesn't have to check in with Rich. He doesn't have to get our theological position on it. He'll do what he wants. So although I tend to believe he doesn't do that anymore, I'm also willing to admit that he might. And so I'll leave it there. And so we'll end with this point. Where's Jesus in the text? As you see Daniel stand before Nebuchadnezzar, you cannot help but see Jesus in front of Herod and Pilate. I mean, now you think of about Arioch and Nebuchadnezzar. As you see Daniel interacting with these powerful people, as you see Daniel in front of Nebuchadnezzar, you cannot help but see Jesus in front of Pilate, Jesus in front of Herod. Everyone in a frenzy. Jesus completely calm, cool, collected. In spite of the fact that not only did his life hang in the balance, he knew he was about to give his life as an offering for sin. He knew what awaited him at Calvary. He knew the horrific death he was about to die. He knew he was about to bear the wrath of God so that you and I might be saved. And yet, just like Daniel, completely calm in the midst of chaos. And so I submit unto you Daniel chapter 2, verses 1 to 30. Lord willing, we'll pick up here next week and really look at the interpretation. Until the Lord gets us back together again here on YouTube, if you missed the lesson, or in Sunday school class, God bless.